Power corrupts, but absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it destroys the human mind entirely. Throughout history, kings and emperors who wielded unlimited authority over millions of lives gradually descended into madness so profound that their subjects lived in terror of their next whim. Today, we delve into the unsettling chronicles of monarchs whose behaviors were so disturbing, so utterly detached from reality, that they challenge our very understanding of human sanity. These weren't merely eccentric rulers with quirky preferences. These were men whose unchecked power transformed them into something barely recognizable as human. From emperors who believed they were made of glass to kings who held military tribunals for rats, these stories reveal the darkest truths about what happens when no one can say no to a ruler's increasingly deranged demands. The accounts you're about to hear are gleaned from documented historical facts, preserved in court records, diplomatic correspondences, and the hushed, terrified testimonies of those who witnessed these monarchs' descent into madness. Each case study vividly illustrates how the isolation of absolute power, combined with the erosion of checks and balances on a ruler's behavior, creates the ideal breeding ground for complete psychological breakdown. What makes these stories particularly chilling is not just their grotesque nature, but their basis in verifiable history. These weren't mythical tyrants or fictional monsters dreamed up for cautionary tales. They were real men who ruled real kingdoms, making decisions that affected millions of lives while trapped in the suffocating prison of their own shattered minds. The progression from eccentric ruler to dangerous madman follows a disturbingly consistent pattern across cultures and centuries. Initially, these monarchs displayed merely unusual preferences or behaviors that courtiers learned to accommodate with subtle eye rolls and forced smiles. However, as their power solidified and any semblance of opposition crumbled, these quirks morphed into increasingly extreme and harmful obsessions. Modern psychology recognizes many of these behaviors as symptoms of severe mental illness, conditions that today might be addressed with therapy and medication. However, in their historical context, these kings' madness was often attributed to divine displeasure, demonic influence, or simply the inherent instability of royal blood. Their subjects, left with no recourse, were forced to endure whatever horrors their diseased minds could conceive. The human cost of these rulers' insanity extended far beyond the gilded palace walls. Entire kingdoms reeled under the weight of their king's delusions, with precious resources squandered on bizarre, often nonsensical projects, innocent people condemned to gruesome executions for imaginary crimes, and vital diplomatic relations irrevocably damaged by incomprehensible, often offensive behavior. These stories serve as a stark and unflinching reminder that unchecked power doesn't just corrupt, it can obliterate the human psyche, leaving behind a destructive force capable of unimaginable cruelty. James I of England ascended to the throne in 1603, bringing with him a collection of personal habits so revolting that even his most loyal courtiers struggled to remain in his presence. Despite his reputation as a learned scholar and the commissioner of the famous King James Bible, this monarch's relationship with basic hygiene was so catastrophically poor that it became a defining and deeply unpleasant characteristic of his reign. The king's aversion to bathing was legendary throughout Europe. Court records paint a portrait of a man who went months, sometimes years, without washing, believing that water weakened the body and made it susceptible to disease. His unwashed hair became a thriving ecosystem, a breeding ground for an army of lice so extensive that courtiers could actually hear them moving when they stood close to the king. The infestation was so severe that the parasites would frequently dislodge themselves from his head, raining down upon official documents during important state meetings, a truly horrifying spectacle. His breath was described by the Venetian ambassador as putrid beyond description, a condition that made private audiences a test of endurance for foreign dignitaries. The king's teeth, blackened and rotting from neglect and a diet heavy in sugared fruits, contributed to an oral odor so powerful that it could clear a room faster than a royal decree. Court physicians, too terrified to suggest proper dental care, instead offered the king strong wines and perfumed waters that did absolutely nothing to address the underlying festering problems. James's clothing, never properly cleaned, accumulated layers of grease, food stains, and bodily fluids that created a permanent and overpowering stench around his person. The silk doublets and velvet robes that should have represented royal magnificence instead became repositories of filth, living testaments to the king's appalling hygiene. Courtiers learned to position themselves strategically upwind of the king during ceremonies, and many developed the habit of breathing exclusively through their mouths when forced into close proximity with their sovereign, a desperate attempt to mitigate the olfactory assault. The psychological implications of James' hygiene habits extended far beyond mere personal preference. His deliberate and ostentatious rejection of cleanliness seemed to represent a fundamental disconnection from the social norms that even the lowest peasants understood. This wasn't ignorance. James was highly educated and certainly aware of basic hygiene practices. Instead, his filthiness appeared to be an assertion of royal privilege taken to its most disgusting extreme, a way of demonstrating that he was above even the most basic requirements of civilized society. Foreign visitors often left England with shocking tales of the unwashed king that significantly damaged diplomatic relationships and tarnished England's reputation across Europe. French courtiers, themselves not known for obsessive bathing habits, were nonetheless appalled by James's condition. Spanish ambassadors reported home that the English king's appearance and smell made formal negotiations extremely difficult to conduct with appropriate dignity and seriousness. The tragedy of James I lies not just in his personal degradation, but in how his unchecked power allowed him to impose his revolting presence on everyone around him. No one possessed the authority to demand that their king maintain basic human cleanliness, and so an entire court, and by extension, the nation, was forced to endure the consequences of one man's descent into filthy madness. In the annals of royal madness, few delusions have been as persistent or as tragic as that of Charles VI of France, who ruled from 1380 to 1422. This monarch, known to history as Charles the Mad, developed a psychological condition so bizarre and so firmly entrenched that it challenges our understanding of the human mind's capacity for self-deception. Charles became utterly, unshakably convinced that his body was made entirely of glass, a delusion that dominated the final decades of his life and terrorized his entire kingdom. The king's glass delusion, medically known today as glass delusion syndrome, manifested in the most extreme and debilitating ways imaginable. Charles refused to allow anyone to touch him, convinced that even the slightest contact would cause him to shatter into 1,000 pieces, leaving him a broken, useless heap of royal shards. He would stand motionless for hours, sometimes days, afraid that any sudden movement, even a breath too deep, might cause catastrophic breakage. Court sessions became surreal displays of a king frozen in terror of his own imagined fragility. To accommodate his delusion, court tailors were ordered to sew iron rods into the king's clothing, creating a primitive but effective suit of armor designed to protect his supposedly glass body from accidental damage. These metal reinforcements made his royal robes incredibly heavy and cumbersome, but Charles insisted they were absolutely necessary to prevent him from cracking under the weight of normal movement. The sight of their king encased in this bizarre protective garment became a daily, unsettling reminder of his complete psychological collapse. The practical implications of ruling a kingdom while believing oneself to be made of glass proved nearly impossible to manage. Charles could not sit normally on his throne, instead requiring specially padded seats resembling oversized cushions that he believed would cushion his fragile glass body. He refused to ride horses, walk on stone floors, or participate in any court ceremonies that might involve even the slightest physical contact. State business ground to a halt as the king became increasingly paralyzed by his irrational fears. His delusion extended to his sleeping arrangements, where Charles demanded that his bed be surrounded by cushions and soft materials to prevent injury should he roll over during the night and accidentally shatter himself. He employed a retinue of servants whose sole responsibility was to ensure that no hard objects came within arm's reach of their glass king. The royal chambers were stripped bare of anything that might pose a threat to his imagined crystalline structure. Foreign ambassadors reported home about the sheer impossibility of conducting normal diplomatic relations with a monarch who believed he would shatter if someone shook his hand. Treaty negotiations became elaborate pantomimes where documents had to be placed on tables for the king to read rather than handed to him directly, a bizarre ballet of avoidance and exaggerated caution. The dignity and authority of the French crown suffered immeasurable damage as word spread throughout Europe about their glass king, the laughingstock of the continent. The most tragic aspect of Charles VI's condition was its duration. This delusion persisted for over 30 years, effectively ending effective royal governance in France during one of the most crucial periods in European history. While his kingdom faced devastating wars, crippling economic crises, and widespread social upheaval, their king remained trapped in a prison of glass, too terrified of breaking to function as the leader his people desperately needed. France, during these critical decades, was essentially leaderless, adrift in a sea of political and social turmoil. Peter III of Russia reigned for only 6 months in 1762, but his brief time on the throne revealed a level of psychological immaturity so profound that it bordered on complete dissociation from reality. This 34-year-old emperor approached the governance of the largest empire on earth with the mentality of a child playing with toys, transforming the serious business of statecraft into elaborate, often absurd games that horrified his court and ultimately led to his downfall. The emperor's obsession with toy soldiers and war games reached levels that defied comprehension. Peter maintained enormous collections of meticulously crafted miniature armies, complete with tiny cannons that actually fired miniature projectiles, cavalry units with horses adorned with minuscule saddles, and infantry formations arranged in precise, historically accurate formations. These weren't merely casual diversions. They became the primary focus of his attention, taking precedence over actual military affairs and critical state business. High-ranking court officials, including generals and ambassadors, were forced to wait for hours, sometimes days, while their emperor indulged in his childish fascination with dolls. Peter's war games extended beyond simple toy arrangement into elaborate theatrical productions that consumed entire days and involved the entire court. He would force members of his court, regardless of rank or age, to participate in mock battles, assigning them roles as different army units and requiring them to march around the palace following his shouted commands and absurd strategies. Grown men, many of them accomplished military officers and seasoned government officials, were reduced to crawling around on their hands and knees, pretending to be toy soldiers for their emperor's amusement, a spectacle of utter degradation. The emperor's disconnect from reality became even more apparent in his treatment of actual military personnel and his bizarre justice system. Peter would conduct formal military tribunals for rats that he claimed had committed acts of desertion, treason, and cowardice. These proceedings followed proper military protocol, complete with charges read aloud with dramatic flair, testimony from often coerced witnesses, and formal sentencing, meticulously documented and recorded by terrified scribes. The rats, whether dead or alive, would be subjected to bizarre military punishments, including execution by hanging from tiny gallows that Peter had specially constructed for this purpose, a macabre parody of justice. His childish approach to governance extended to his handling of delicate diplomatic relations, where Peter would insist on conducting negotiations while simultaneously playing with his toy soldiers, often using them to illustrate his points, much to the bewilderment and frustration of his foreign counterparts. Foreign ambassadors reported the surreal and deeply unsettling experience of discussing crucial trade agreements and vital military alliances while the Emperor of Russia moved toy cavalry units around a sandbox, simulating battles that often contradicted his actual negotiating positions. These displays of complete immaturity and lack of seriousness severely damaged Russia's credibility on the international stage and left diplomats questioning whether they were dealing with a sovereign nation or an elaborate practical joke orchestrated by a madman. Peter's inability to distinguish between play and reality created chaos throughout the Russian government. He would issue official military orders based solely on the outcomes of his toy battles, promoting and demoting real officers according to how well their miniature counterparts had performed in his imaginary wars, often overlooking actual competence and experience in favor of the success of a wooden figurine. Actual military strategy and long-term planning were abandoned in favor of tactics that worked well with wooden soldiers but had absolutely no basis in real-world combat effectiveness, placing the entire Russian military at a significant disadvantage. The emperor's wife, Catherine, later Catherine the Great, watched in horror as her husband's childish obsessions threatened to dismantle the empire she was destined to rule. His courtiers, many of whom had served under previous rulers with distinction and unwavering loyalty, found themselves trapped in a waking nightmare where the fate of millions depended on the whims of a man who preferred the company of toy soldiers to real people. Peter's reign ended abruptly when Catherine, recognizing the imminent danger he posed to the stability of Russia, organized a swift and decisive coup that removed him from power, likely with considerable relief from his long-suffering court. But not before his 6 months of toy soldier governance had demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of placing unlimited power in the hands of someone completely disconnected from adult reality, a cautionary tale for future generations. King Farouk of Egypt, who ruled from 1936 to 1952, transformed the ancient dignity of pharaonic power into a grotesque spectacle of compulsive theft, insatiable sexual obsession, and rampant material greed that shocked even the most jaded observers of royal excess. This monarch, who inherited one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the Middle East, developed habits so bizarre, self-destructive, and outright criminal that they would eventually contribute to the complete collapse of the Egyptian monarchy and the end of centuries of royal rule. Farouk's compulsive stealing became legendary throughout diplomatic circles and high society, earning him a well-deserved reputation as the most accomplished royal pickpocket in history. No object, regardless of its value or personal significance to its owner, was safe from his grasping fingers. He would brazenly steal watches from the wrists of unsuspecting dinner guests, fountain pens from the pockets of visiting ambassadors, and jewelry, often of considerable value, from the necks of women attending lavish state functions. Most famously, and perhaps most audaciously, he successfully pickpocketed a valuable watch directly from Winston Churchill during a high-stakes diplomatic meeting, a theft so audacious and disrespectful that it became international news, causing a major diplomatic incident and permanently damaging Egypt's standing with Britain. The king's obsessive fascination with red automobiles bordered on the pathological, consuming his thoughts and actions to an unhealthy degree. Farouk maintained a vast and ever-growing collection of over 200 red cars, ranging from vintage fire engines to sleek Ferraris, all meticulously painted in various shades of crimson, each meticulously chosen to match his exacting standards. He would spend hours each day inspecting his prized fleet, often ordering his mechanics to painstakingly repaint entire vehicles if their red wasn't precisely the correct shade, demonstrating a level of control and attention to detail that was completely absent in his governance of the country. Egyptian law was actually changed under royal decree to ensure that only the king could legally own a red vehicle, effectively making the possession of red cars by anyone else a criminal offense punishable by imprisonment, a testament to his unchecked power and childish whims. Perhaps most disturbing and indicative of his deeply troubled psyche was Farouk's vast accumulation of pornographic material, which became so extensive and all-encompassing that it was widely considered to be the largest private collection in the entire world. The king employed a dedicated staff of dozens, whose sole responsibility was meticulously cataloging, organizing, and maintaining his vast library of explicit materials sourced from every corner of the globe and representing every conceivable genre of pornography. He would spend entire days sequestered in his private chambers, viewing his collection, often neglecting important state business and ignoring pressing matters of national importance to indulge in his sordid obsession. The storage and maintenance of this immense collection required an entire wing of the royal palace, a testament to the scale of his addiction. Farouk's eating habits reached levels of extreme excess that defied medical explanation and stretched the limits of human physiology. He would consume meals consisting of dozens of courses, each richer and more decadent than the last, often eating continuously for hours without stopping, seemingly incapable of feeling full. Palace records, meticulously kept by terrified and overworked servants, detail single meals that included multiple whole roasted chickens, entire sides of beef, and an almost comical number of desserts, often numbering in the dozens, each a calorie bomb designed to satisfy his insatiable appetite. His obesity became so extreme and debilitating that special furniture, reinforced with steel supports, had to be custom built to support his immense weight, and diplomatic protocols had to be awkwardly adjusted to accommodate his physical limitations, creating a farcical spectacle during international meetings. The king's sexual appetites were equally excessive, indiscriminate, and often exploitative. He maintained a sprawling harem that included hundreds of women from across the Mediterranean, many of whom were essentially kidnapped and held against their will, forced into servitude, and subjected to his whims. His sexual demands were so constant, relentless, and extreme that palace physicians expressed serious concerns about his long-term health, while the women in his harem lived in a state of perpetual terror, never knowing when they might be summoned to satisfy his insatiable and often cruel needs. The psychological profile that emerges from Farouk's documented behavior suggests a man completely consumed by the pursuit of immediate gratification, utterly unable to delay or control any impulse, regardless of its social, political, or even ethical consequences. His stealing wasn't motivated by financial need. He was one of the wealthiest men on earth, possessing unimaginable riches, but by a compulsive inability to resist taking anything that caught his fleeting attention, a manifestation of his complete lack of impulse control. This same lack of impulse control extended to every single aspect of his life, from his uncontrolled eating and his insatiable sexual desires to his obsessive accumulation of useless objects and his blatant disregard for the welfare of his own people. The ultimate tragedy of Farouk's reign lies in how his deeply ingrained personal obsessions consumed the vast resources and diverted the critical attention that should have been devoted to governing Egypt effectively during a particularly turbulent and crucial period in Middle Eastern history. While his people struggled with widespread poverty and his nation faced complex and increasingly urgent political challenges, their king remained almost entirely focused on satisfying his endless appetites for food, sex, stolen trinkets, and fleeting moments of selfish pleasure, ultimately leading to his downfall and the collapse of the monarchy. So, as we've seen, the stories of James I, Charles VI, Peter III, and King Farouk paint a disturbing picture of what happens when absolute power meets unchecked mental instability. It's a potent reminder that power, without accountability or a grounding in reality, can not only corrupt but completely shatter the human psyche, with devastating consequences for those both near and far from the throne. These historical figures, trapped in their own distorted realities, ultimately became prisoners of their own power, and their reigns serve as stark warnings about the fragility of sanity when faced with limitless authority. Now, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this. What did you find most shocking or thought-provoking about these stories? Do you know of any other historical examples that fit this pattern? Please leave a comment down below and let's start a discussion. I'd love to hear your insights and perspectives. And if you enjoy delving into these historical accounts of power and madness, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future explorations of history's darker corners. There's always more to uncover, and I look forward to continuing this journey with you.